Yeah, we're talking about workers' compensation. If a worker gets injured in the course of his or her job, the law provides for the worker to be compensated through a streamlined system that avoids the necessity of proving a tort. In other words, they don't need to really go to court. All they need to do is prove that they were injured on the job, and they start getting payments from workers' compensation. Now, workers' compensation doesn't pay you your entire wage. Workers' compensation usually pays you 66%, 2/3 of your wages. This system is available in all 50 states. It's a federal program. It is insured by the federal government, and it's known as the Workers' Compensation Law. Once upon a time, we had individuals in the United States who were known as robber barons. These individuals would hire people, usually off the boat, new immigrants coming into the United States. And one of the things that they would do is they would have fairly dangerous situations in their factories, and if somebody got hurt, they just fired them. Of course, you can't do that anymore because of the Workers' Compensation Law. The Workers' Compensation Law was passed in the 1920s, 1930s, during the Great Depression, when things were more as conservatives would say. We had a more socialist outlook on things. It was passed at that time, or at least it was presented at that time. It wasn't passed until later on. But of course, after World War II, we had a lot of men coming back from the war, and then of course the Korean War started. And at this time, we passed some fairly interesting laws. There was a fear of communism at this time. During World War II, of course, we were allied with, there were three basic political movements going on in the world. Democracy, of course, similar to what we have. There was democracy, there was fascism. Fascism was a strong central government. And then there was communism. Communism followed a socialist, more socialist brand of economy, where there was better compensation, where the individual that owned the company took less profits out, and those were the three. The reason that Hitler was able to take over in Germany is because one of the reasons is because he was wrestling with the socialists for control, and his was a more centralist form of government. One of the interesting things that happened was that the socialists were very popular in Germany at this time, and because of that, they changed the name of the Nazi Party. The Nazi Party actually means National Socialists. But they weren't socialist at all. As a matter of fact, they were the opposite. And they fought communists, and they captured communists. They threw them in jail wherever they could find them. And that's one of the reasons why they were so upset with the Soviet Union. That's one of the reasons why they invaded, because they were afraid that form of government was going to take over their government. And I don't know why I'm talking about politics instead of psychology. In workers' compensation systems, employers contribute to the large fund that insures workers who are injured at work, and employers also waive the right to blame the worker or some other individual for the injury. That has to do with the workers' compensation law. What was happening before, or what was happening when they first passed the law, the company would just say, it was his fault, he meant to do this, that's why he's injured, he destroyed this much stuff, now he's got to compensate us for it. And the government came in and said, you're keeping this stuff in court for an extended length of time, and this man and his family are starving to death. So what you need to do is not do that anymore. You can't blame the individual that's injured for their injury. If workers are compensated, the size of the award they receive is determined by the type and duration of the injury, their salary at the time of injury. As I said, it's about 66, about 2/3 of their salary is maximum, depending on what type of injury they have, of course. Workers can seek compensation for physical and psychological injuries suffered at work, the cost of whatever treatment is given. They can be compensated for lost wages and the loss of future earning capacity if they are incapacitated for an extended length of time. Now, what happens is workers' compensation is an insurance. It's kind of like Aflac. Well, it's not really kind of like Aflac. What happens is each company will pays into an insurance fund, and the federal government not only insures that, but also puts in an equal amount of money into the fund. So if somebody is injured, it doesn't cost more money for the company. The company is always paying exactly the same amount into the fund. So it's not like somebody gets injured for life, so they raise the amount of money that the company has to pay. It doesn't work that way. It's not like car insurance or health insurance. If you get sick, then all of a sudden they raise your premiums. If you have a speeding ticket or you're in a wreck, and all of a sudden your car insurance doubles or whatever. It doesn't work that way as far as this stuff is concerned. It's all a set rate, and they have to pay a select amount of money on each individual. Formal trials, of course, the more dangerous their job is, or the more dangerous the manufacturer or the type of job it is, the more money they have to put into the fund. Formal trials are not held, and this is one of the reasons why working as a contractor or a builder is fairly expensive for the contractor or builder, because he has to pay so much money into workers' compensation. Formal trials are not held, and juries do not resolve these cases. They are heard and decided by a hearing officer or commissioner. Clinicians are often asked to render an opinion about the existence, cause, and implications of any mental disorders. So the biggest problem, the reason that you would be called in as a psychologist, is to determine if there is permanent psychological damage or if there is any psychological damage to the individual that has suffered the injury. Claims for mental disability usually arise in three ways. Either they're physical mental cases, physical injury can lead to a mental disorder and psychological disability. There are mental cases. An individual suffers a traumatic incident at work that leads to substantial psychological difficulties, and of course this can potentially happen. I'm trying to think of an example. Something like this just happened. Traumatic event. If they were a truck driver and they were in an accident, and now of course they're afraid to drive. Well, in that case, the traumatic incident of the accident would cause the individual to have psychological difficulties as far as driving is concerned. Mental, physical, a work-related stress leads to an onset of a physical condition such as high blood pressure or something else. So stress, of course, is one of the things that you can be compensated for. In recent years, there has been a surge in mental cases, and of course everybody wants to know what the hell's going on. Perhaps it's due to the rise in female workers, no offense to females, of course. Women are more often diagnosed with anxiety and depression disorders, and so the stress that they concur it in a work environment might potentially give them anxiety and depression. Perhaps it's due to a shift in the job market from manufacturing industrial jobs to service-oriented jobs. If you've never worked in a factory, factories are very repetitive work. You do the same thing over and 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 over, and then you go home. Then you come back to work, you do the same thing over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. It's kind of fun. I worked in factories when I was in college. I worked in factories, which is always interesting. Some people have to do the same thing over and over and over and over again. Other individuals, you can switch them from job to job because they're adaptive. Some individuals aren't adaptive and some individuals are adaptive. And since I was a college student, they figured I was adaptive. So they kept giving me new jobs. And of course they would say, this is how you do it. They would do it really fast. And then I would do it a couple times and mess up, of course. And then I'd figure out what was going on. And then I'd figure out a way to do it a lot faster. So I always got in trouble for making too many parts. Yeah, I set a record. I used to work for Hyster. Hyster makes tow motors. No, tow motor is another type. Anyway, they made those forklifts. They made forklifts. And I was manufacturing parts. I was actually drilling parts out of stock. So this is a solid piece of metal, and they just throw this piece of metal into a lathe, and I'd make it into whatever it was supposed to look like. Anyway, so the first time I did it, of course, I screwed up. But the second time I did it, I screwed up. Third time I did it, I broke the blade. And then the fourth time I did it, I figured it out. And so all of a sudden, I'm making all these parts. They were real impressed that all of these quality parts were coming off this machine. Of course, you have to measure them all the time because the blade gets dull and the precision's not very good. So you have to change the blade out when you need to, all that kind of stuff. Why am I talking about this? Oh, we're talking about, so the job market has changed from manufacturing industrial jobs to service-oriented jobs. One of the reasons that Donald Trump was elected president is because he said he was going to bring all the manufacturing jobs back to the United States. Well, he has brought some manufacturing jobs back to the United States, but not all the manufacturing jobs back to the United States. What happened in the 1980s, we elected Ronald Reagan president, and Ronald Reagan said, we are no longer competitive in the world market because we need to retool. What he was talking about was that most of the factories, factory owners don't like to spend money. They like to make a lot of money and build big houses. That's what they like to do. So what was happening, the factories were getting old, the machinery was getting old, so he decided he was going to give all the manufacturers tax breaks. And they did, they gave them all tax breaks, and of course all the manufacturers were making all this money. They didn't have to pay taxes that year. Everybody was just giddy because, the millionaires suddenly became billionaires. It was really kind of an exciting time for very, very wealthy people. Not so much for the workers. Okay, so he gave them this tax break so that they could retool, but they didn't retool. What they did, they took the money that they saved from not having to pay taxes that year, and they took it overseas, and they built factories overseas where the labor was cheaper, and it was cheaper to build a building, and they didn't have all of the laws in the United States, the EPA laws and whatnot. See, this is one of the reasons that Trump this economy is so strong. One of the reasons is because they've done away with all these regulations, all these EPA regulations. So now they're dumping all kinds of interesting toxic wastes into the water. The air is dirtier than it's been in 50 years, that kind of stuff. Anyway, Ronald Reagan did that. As much fun as that is. Why am I talking about this? Oh yeah, manufacturing jobs. Okay, so all those manufacturing jobs left the United States. Now this may not be that important to people on the Navajo reservation because you don't have any manufacturing on the Navajo reservation, and you never have had manufacturing. But I'm from an area where there were a lot of automotive factories. We had Chevrolet, we had Delco, we had Guide Lamp, we had Delco Battery. We had Borg Warner. They made transmissions. I worked in a factory where we made automotive water pumps for cars. It's kind of an interesting place. All of those factories are closed now. They've all closed down. Why? Because they all moved into either Mexico or Canada. They moved overseas. So a lot of the parts for the United States, for American automobile industry is made overseas. A lot of it's made in China because the labor is so cheap over there. They were not paying us that well, but for the 1980s, it wasn't bad money. Anyway, okay, so the manufacturing jobs left, and now we have service-oriented jobs. And this, of course, has to do with more interpersonal stressors. When you work in a manufacturing job, you do the same thing over and over and over and over and over and over again. Then you go home, then you come back, and you do the same thing over and over and over again. And this is one of the reasons why these guys smoked a lot. This is another reason why they drank beer a lot, because they had such boring jobs. They had a boring life. They would go home, they would eat supper, sit down in front of the television set, and drink beer.
That sounds like one of my friends.
Is that right?
I play video games online, so I met this guy online like years ago, like back in 2006 when I was still in high school. And yeah, that's crazy. And I met him on one of the games, and he lives out in Connecticut. And he talks about working out in the steel mill, and that's basically what he does. Where he comes home, gets himself dinner, he just like throws back several beers and plays video games.
All night long, until he goes to bed. And then he wakes up in the morning.
Yeah, goes back to work,
Yeah, that's quite a life. That's a great life. And there were there were millions of people in the United States doing the same thing. All the people that I went to high school with, this is what they wanted to do. Of course, they can make a lot more money. When I got married the first time, I married a lady whose dad was a factory worker. And the great thing about being a factory worker is that every Friday you get paid. So you get this big paycheck every Friday. So that means Friday night, Saturday, and Sunday are party. You know, it's like Christmas every Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And of course, the rest of the week you got no money, but that's okay because come Friday you're going to get another paycheck as long as you go. I mean, you work 40 hours, and you're making $10 an hour. You get to go home with a big paycheck, and that was their life. And of course, I was an academic, and my wife didn't like that. She wanted that paycheck every Friday. She didn't like the whole idea of going to school and spending all that money on education and then not making any money. She's kind of right, I guess. I haven't really made a whole lot of money, but all the factory jobs went away. So if I'd gone into the factory right out of high school, I'd have been SOL. In the 1990s when all the factories closed, I would have been SOL. I have a friend that, let's not even talk about him. Anyway, he was a supervisor, and of course at this time, if you were important, then you snorted cocaine. So he snorted cocaine and blew and had a stroke. You know, this was in his 30s. He had a stroke in his 30s. So he started being compensated for all this stuff. Hello? Good morning. I'm in class. I'll call you back later, okay? Wants to borrow money. I won't lend anybody money while I'm in class. But maybe after. Researchers have considered questions such as what factors threaten the impartiality of forensic evaluations in workers' compensation cases. So my friend had a stroke. And he was a supervisor, and he's making, he's tearing down $150,000, $200,000 a year. So he got workers' compensation. This lasted for, 15 years or so. And then the factory closed. But not only did the factory close, but the people that owned it sold it to another company. Well, that company were raiders, and what they did, they robbed the what am I thinking of? What's the word I'm looking for? They took all the money out of all the money they put in there for retirement. The retirement fund. They raided the retirement fund. And usually that's one of the reasons why they were corporate raiders. This is what they do. They go in, they take over a company, they steal all the assets, many of the liquid assets as they can, and then they sell off the hard assets. And that's what happened to the company that he was working for. And he was working for a UAW organization, and they were bought out by a Canadian company. The Canadian company came in and snatched all the money and all the assets, and they left all these people high and dry. Well, they'd been paying all this money into the retirement fund for, as long as they'd been working, and it was all gone. So all of a sudden his retirement was gone. And so what he wanted to happen, what he wanted was for Obama to force that company to make restitution to all these people that paid into the retirement fund. Anyway, it didn't happen.
It didn't happen.
And so he's really pissed off of course, he's the one that had the stroke. So he's only got half a brain. So he loves Donald Trump. I don't know if that has anything to do with his half brain or if it's because he wants his money. But he lives in Kentucky now. Researchers have considered questions such as what factors threaten the impartiality of forensic evaluation in workers' compensation cases. An expert who is repeatedly hired by the same attorney, whether a plaintiff's or defense attorney, may risk opining what the attorney wants rather than rendering impartial opinions about each case. In other words, they hire a psychologist they know will say the same thing over and over and over again. Whatever they want them to say, they will say it, even though that is not ethical. Question of civil competence focuses on whether an individual has the capacity to understand information that is relevant to decision-making in a given situation. This has to do with civil competence. Then make an informed choice about what to do in that situation. There are select people in the United States that want a civil competency hearing for every person that votes, because they want to say that you can't vote because you don't understand what's going on, and you can't vote because you don't understand what's going on. But I'm an old white guy, so hey, I obviously must be civilly competent. There are organizations like that, and though most of those organizations are Republicans, they want to reduce the number of people that can vote. So they don't want minorities to vote. They don't want liberals to vote. They don't want anybody to vote except people that will agree with them. Here are some questions that address issues of civil competence. Is one competent to manage his or her financial affairs? Can one make competent decisions about medical or psychiatric treatment? And of course, that's another question. Is one competent to execute a will and decide how to distribute property? This comes up anytime anybody's got a little bit of extra money, and they write a will. The will can always be contested. I come from a family that my dad was a banker, and we didn't really live very high on the hog. As a matter of fact, we didn't live high on the hog at all. But he kept accumulating stock in the company, in his bank. He was a banker. He kept accumulating stock. So by the time he retired, he had about $1 million worth of stock, which sounds like a lot of money. And normally what you do is you just keep reinvesting it and then make more money and more money. That way you live off the dividends. So you've got $1 million worth of stock. So what are the dividends that year? Well, maybe they're $30,000 or maybe $40,000, who knows, whatever. Or maybe the bank did poorly and you only made $25,000 this year. But you can live off of $25,000. Anyway, so here my dad, he's doing this. And of course he retires in his 70s. He retired in '85. Okay. He retired in 1985. So for 15 years, he's getting all these dividends. Everything's going great. You know, he's got 6 kids. 2003, my sister died. So now he's only got 5 kids. So then my dad dies, and all the money reverts to my mother. And my mother is not just a Democrat, she's a socialist. My mother, yeah, my dad's a Republican. And my mother's a socialist. So it gets to be a lot of fun. All of a sudden, it gets to be a lot of fun. Because my mother hates money and she doesn't want to talk about it. But she's sitting on this big pile of money. And of course, she's got Social Security payments coming in all the time. And she's the kind of a person that if there's a water fountain and a Coke machine, she'll drink the water and not buy a Coke because she doesn't want to spend the money for the Coke. That's my mom. Of course, she grew up during the Depression, so it makes a lot of sense. Anyway, why am I talking about this? Oh, we're talking about competence to fill out a will. Okay, so when so my dad made out his will. Of course, he made it out back in 1985 when he retired. So the will's still intact, of course. My dad dies. Nobody gets any money because, well, my mother. It's all my mother's money. And of course, she doesn't ever talk about money. You can't borrow a nickel from her. So finally, and she gets older and older and older. And finally, at 98, she dies as well. So now we've got a big pile of money, and I've got 2 brothers that are the executor of the will. Now, one of the reasons I'm not the executor of the will is because I wasn't there. I'm not in Indiana, and these 2 brothers are in Indiana. So the 2 brothers I've got a brother in South Carolina, and I'm wherever the hell I am. And then I've got 2 brothers in Indiana. So they decide that they become the executors of the will. Now the question is, do they have the ideas that my dad has? You know, my dad's a Republican, he's kind of that kind of a person, and my mom is a socialist. So if they have socialist ideas, they will distribute it evenly. That's the idea. And if they have the Republican ideas, somebody's going to try to get as much money as they possibly can. Okay. So there's 2 brothers, and one of them is one way, one of them is the other way. Luckily for all of us, the one that was the Republican, the one that was the greedier of the 2, had already borrowed money against his inheritance. He'd already borrowed almost all the money; it was almost already gone. So he wasn't the executor of the will. It was my other brother, the one that's suffering with PTSD. Now that was the question. See, all of a sudden, he's the one that is in charge of all the money, but he suffers from PTSD. So is he competent to execute a will and distribute the property? That was the question. It was a huge question because I have a sister-in-law who wanted more money than she did. So she took him to court to say that he wasn't competent. Now, if you look at my brother, he's got a beard and he's got long hair. Sometimes he cuts his hair and sometimes he doesn't. Sometimes he washes his hair and sometimes he doesn't. So he kind of looks a little sketchy sometimes. He's a very bright person. He reads constantly. So the question came up, was he competent or not? Or not. So my more Republican brother took him. He didn't take him to court. It was his wife that took my brother to court. And of course, he knew more about everything than anybody else did. So, and it was fairly obvious to everybody that he was going to distribute things evenly and fairly. Anyway, and he did, and he did a good job. Unfortunately, remember the recession of 2008, where everybody lost all their money. Well, that big pile of cash got split in half because I know all those stocks just tanked. So it was only worth about $500,000. But if you take $500,000 and divide it by 5, you get $100,000, so that's not too bad. But there are other monies that needed to be distributed out of that. Each grandchild got $20,000, and there were like 10 of them. I had two kids myself, so they got a big pile of, they got $20,000 anyway. Can a person make advanced decisions about the kind of medical treatment he or she wants or does not want to receive if terminally ill or seriously injured? Let me go back to the whole will thing. I had an aunt that she really married well. She kept marrying millionaires, and she kept piling up all the money that she made off of these guys. And she was really good with the stock market. She owned part of the Cubs. She was kind of an interesting lady. Anyway, she ended up with $35 million. And this is my aunt. So she ended up with $35 million. And she got older and older and older, and everybody was going, what's going to happen to Aunt Alice's money? Of course, she had 4 brothers and sisters. By that time, she only had 2 sisters left. The 2 brothers had died. But both of those guys had children, and all the children, of course, are wanting some of that cash, some of that $35 million. So there was a question as to what her will looked like, and nobody knew. She wouldn't tell anybody. It was one of those kind of deals. If you've ever been around wealthy people, they don't trust people. The reason they don't trust people is because they think everybody's after their money. And in a lot of cases, they are right. People are after their money. And in my aunt's case, of course, she kind of held her money up, and she wanted everybody to, jump for it.
That's called fun.
And this had been going on for 10 or 15 years. And so everybody went, I don't care. I would rather not denigrate myself than have your money. So by the time she died, nobody wanted her money. I mean, it was like she's sitting on this big pile of money. And since nobody sucked up to her, she got pissed off, and she left her money to, my uncle died. I had an uncle, and he was sitting on about $15 million, and he left half of it to the Shriners Children's Hospital. Isn't that sweet? My aunt sued Shriners Children's Hospital for the money, and she won her case. I know. So instead of Shriners Hospital getting the $7.5 million, my aunt got the whole pile.
How did they manage that?
Well, how did she manage it?
On what laws?
What law?
Well, if they won the case by suing Shriners to get the money back.
Right. Well,
What
she
was the
actually
basis?
sued the estate to keep the money. Shriners never got the money, but the money was supposed to go to Shriners.
Oh, okay.
So eventually, what happened was when she died, she's sitting on $35 million. She gave Shriners. She left Shriners $15 million. She left them all the money that was in my uncle's account. So that leaves $20 million, right? So she left the other $20 million to this house in Chicago. It's a museum for Huguenots. Huguenots, once upon a time, they were a Protestant group in France and Germany, the Huguenots. And the Huguenots they used to fight with the Catholics all the time. There were all these massacres taking place between the Huguenots and the Catholics. And my people are Huguenots, of course. And at one point they were just driven out of Europe. If you were a Huguenot, they either killed you or they sent you someplace. And most of them came over here. Congratulations, you guys got all these Huguenots. Anyway, so she left it. But it's this religion that dissolved. It just disappeared back in the 19th century. But there was a Huguenot house in Chicago, and she left all the $20 million to the Huguenot house. So nobody got any money. except the Shriners in a house in Chicago. But at the time, she was being taken care of by her other sister, and the other sister had 4 kids. She had 4 kids. So it's hard to tell how much of that $20 million they pulled out of it before she died. She was in pretty bad shape. She'd had a stroke, so she was fairly incompetent. Okay, so we're talking about wills. Can a person make advanced decisions about the kind of medical treatment he or she wants or does not want to receive if terminally ill or seriously injured? I had a sister-in-law who was suffering from diabetes. And she was able to maintain it for an extended length of time, and then all of a sudden her kidneys stopped functioning. So she had to go on dialysis. She had worked in medicine most of her life, so she understood what dialysis was, but she didn't understand what was going to happen to her. Because almost everybody who is told your kidneys aren't functioning, you need to go on dialysis, goes on dialysis. So she decided not to go on dialysis. She just wanted to die. And she did, but it took her about 6 months to die, and it wasn't very comfortable. It wasn't as comfortable as she thought it was going to be. She thought she'd go into a coma and just not wake up. But that's not what happened. She kept going into a coma and coming out. And of course, all this time, she's not having her blood cleaned up of all of its toxins. So she's accumulating all these toxins, and it was not a very happy time for her. Her last 3 months or so was pretty brutal. Anyway, so she finally died. Committed suicide, in essence, because she refused medical treatment. So the question is, could somebody have taken her to court, or taken her case to court, and had her put on dialysis involuntarily? And the answer is probably yes, but nobody did it. She was kind of an unpleasant person, and nobody wanted to save her life. And she wanted to die, so they just let her die. Now here's the weird part. Her daughter was pregnant when she found out that she needed dialysis. And she chose, rather than to see her grandchild, she chose to die. And the baby was born before she died. So the baby, well, of course the baby doesn't know what the hell she's looking at anyway. So and she was taking care of this, of her grandchildren. Her daughter had 3 other children, and she was taking care of them. But rather than see her grandchildren, be with her grandchildren, she chose to die. As stupid as that is. Anyway, she committed suicide. In essence, a competent individual is expected to be able to, number 1, understand basic information that is relevant to making a decision. Number 2, apply that information to a specific situation in order to anticipate the consequences of various choices. Number 3, use logical or rational thinking to evaluate the pros and cons of various strategies and decisions. And number 4, communicate the personal decision or choice, which was kind of interesting. When she told the doctor that she did not want dialysis, she was very lucid about everything. She was very articulate. She understood medicine. She used the right medical terminology. So they let her go. They didn't try to force her. They didn't try to talk her out of it. Well, they did try to talk her out of it, but she was so damn smart that she knew more than they did. And of course, she allowed herself to die. All the arguments in the world, her grandchildren, of course, her grandchildren weren't arguing about it because they were too young. They were just little guys. So she had all these cute little people running around her, and she didn't like it. As strange as it may seem, before she died, before she started being non-functional, she took her cat in to be euthanized. And who does that? Why not just give it away? No, she euthanized her cat. We got one of her other cats. She had a cat that she liked, and this cat tortured the other cat. And the cat she liked was the one that was the torturer, not the tortured. So we got the tortured cat. Oh my God. And she just thought it was the funniest thing in the world when this Siamese cat would pick on this tortoiseshell cat. She just thought it was the funniest thing in the world. He'd chase it all over the house. She just laughed, thought it was funny. You know, torture, it's funny. It makes everybody just chuckle. Planning about future medical treatments is formalized through what is known as advanced medical directives. I worked in medicine, even when I was working in medicine so long ago, we had advanced medical directives where somebody could say DNR, do not resuscitate. So if somebody started to choke to death, we couldn't do anything to help them. We couldn't do anything. We just had to watch them and try to make them as comfortable as we possibly could. But we couldn't resuscitate them.
There's an episode on House that covers just that. It's literally called DNR2. And it's I guess it's one of his like musical influences or whatever to House. So like there was a conflict because he signed the DNR, but House wanted to save him because he thought there was like something else wrong with him. And not only that, like he was somebody that he looked up to musically.
So he resuscitated.
Yeah.
See, he could have been sued for that.
Wasn't he? He was sued, wasn't he?
Yeah, his wife's on, the guy's wife was the one that took him to court and.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
My mother had a DNR, and every time she drank coffee, she'd have heart palpitations. It looked like a heart attack, and sometimes it was a heart attack. Anyway, so then my brother would take her to the emergency room, and they'd burn her. Well, they would really burn her back. She'd just lay there until her heart started beating properly again. Anyway, so she had a DNR, and this one time they did resuscitate her. And she just swore like my mother could swear. She knew all the words. She was really good at it. She's just cussed those guys out all one side and down the other. And of course, we were there, and anyway, we were embarrassed. This my mother's called the doctor a son of a bitch.
Well, some of us little old ladies can embarrass sailors and truck drivers
There you go.
simultaneously.
There you go, that's what my mother did. Anyway, okay, so these are advanced medical directives. A patient indicates treatment they want, that they should they later become incapacitated and incompetent to make treatment decisions, and this is known as a living will. Once upon a time, DNR was all you could do. Now, of course, you can make out a will that tells everything, that says everything, has everything in it. But that's what living wills look like now. Now, the interesting thing is that my wife, if I'm late for coming home from work, she thinks that I've been in an accident and I'm dead on the road someplace. So she keeps killing me off. Every time I'm late for something, I'm dead. So when we were in the service, and of course I got out of the service in my 30s, she makes me make out this living will, and it's like 15 pages long. So I've got a living will sitting out there somewhere that has all this stuff in it that I made out when I was in my 30s. Of course, I'm 70 now, so I don't know. The question of competence to consent to treatment can arise when one refuses treatment that seems to be justified. And of course, this is what happened to my sister-in-law. She refused treatment. The doctors could have taken her to court. Her kids could have taken her to court to determine whether she was competent or not. She was competent, and she just wanted to die, but she didn't want to commit suicide. If simplifying the information doesn't help, then one can administer a clinical assessment instrument, such as the MacArthur Competence Assessment Tool for treatment decisions, to determine whether the patient lacks the necessary ability to reach a competent decision. My wife's family suffers from depression, fairly serious depression, some of them worse than others. This is a family, when they get around a dinner table, when they got around a dinner table, nobody smiles. Everybody's pissed. Her mother was clinically depressed and was on medication almost her entire life. Her mother, God, her mother was in her 60s, and she had a mother that was in her 90s. So she decided she was going to live until her mother died, and then she was going to die too, so that she could join her husband in heaven. Of course, as logical as all that is. So the mother finally died. She died at 97 of leukemia, strangely enough. She'd had leukemia almost all of her life. So her mother finally died, and then she came down with pancreatic cancer. Like the next month, she was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And if you know anything about pancreatic cancer, it's like 79% fatal. The probability of surviving it is fairly remote. So, you know, it was like a death sentence when she got it. So she decided that she was going to go live with her daughter out in Washington. That's the daughter that decided to kill her, to die of, not go on dialysis. So she's depressed. I mean, now we got two depressed people in the same home. Yeah, I know. The two females in the house are depressed. And actually she has two daughters, and one of them is clinically depressed as well. She's bipolar. She has bipolar disorder. So we've got three depressed females in the house. Two males that are relatively okay, and then a female that wants to leave as fast as she possibly can. She's around all of this mental illness. Anyway, so they put her in a room, and because the father was such a cheap bastard, he didn't heat it. He didn't heat the room. So here she is. She's from Georgia. She's lived in Georgia all of her life. They move her to Washington State, and of course it's cold in the wintertime, and she's in a room that's like 50 or 60 degrees, and she's freezing to death. So she decides that she has to come back to the States. At this point, we are stationed in Japan, so we had to get a Red Cross clearance to come back to the States, because to take care of her mother, who was freezing to death in Washington State. Anyway, so we came back from Japan. We were supposed to be there for 3 years, but instead we were only there for 6 months. So anyway, and she died in my house. As a matter of fact, she died twice in my house. First time she's sitting on the toilet, she died, so I picked her up. And I don't know if you've ever picked up somebody that had just died, but they have no muscle. They don't have any muscles. So I picked her up, and she's okay for, I don't know, about 3 steps, and then all of a sudden she folded up. And so I dropped her on her butt. It wasn't like I just dropped her on her butt. It's like it was a controlled drop.
Yeah.
Okay. So she landed on her butt, and it brought her back to life. So she came back to life. So I picked her up again, and I took her, at this time my wife held her so that she wouldn't fold up like an accordion. And I put her in the bed, and she finally died in bed. So everybody was happy. She got to say goodbye to her daughter. She was in the bathroom for like 15 minutes. We kept yelling at her, "Are you okay? You okay?" And then finally she stopped answering. I think she got irritated because we kept asking her if she was okay.
Probably what was keeping her going.
She died of a big nag, I think. Clinicians can evaluate whether a person called a testator was competent to execute a will. Such competence is a requirement for the will to be valid. And of course, this always happens in families where everybody wants the money. So they will try to determine if they are competent. And then of course, the will with the latest date, is that the one that is going to be the one that is accepted? It doesn't have to, because somebody can contest the will and say that the individual was not competent when they made out the will. As strange as this sounds. This is what happens in people with money, in families with people with money or land. A lot of times, people are arguing about who gets the land. The legal standard for testators' competence to execute a will. Testators must know at the time of making their wills that they are making their wills. Here, sign this. Yeah. Anyway, they have to know that they're making a will. They must know the nature and the extent of their property. They must understand what they have. This gets kind of interesting. They must know the natural objects of their bounty. In other words, if they own a painting that is worth $1 million, they need to know that it's worth $1 million. People have a lot of things around their house, and sometimes they have no clue how much something is worth. That's how it gets thrown into these, you know, these things where people find. I was just talking to somebody. Oh, I was talking to Sue the other day. She said, "Oh, I found a Waterford cut glass bowl worth, you know, $50,000 or whatever," and she bought it for $10, you know, in this estate sale. I'm going, geez, I mean, that's like stealing. I mean, it seems like stealing to me. You should always tell somebody if something's worth something or not. Anyway. Yeah, she found a sweater that evidently was worth a lot of money that she got for $10. You know, I'm thinking, oh, this isn't right. They must know the manner in which the wills that they are making distribute their property. So they need to understand how much money they actually are dealing with here, or what something is worth. If you've got a one-of-a-kind something or other, and it's never been important to you, you know, it's just stuck in the back of your closet, then they need to know that that's actually worth, you know, $10,000 or whatever. Evaluations include a determination of the purpose of the will and why it was written at the time, gathering information about the property holdings, insight into the family dynamics, and assessment of general consequences of the dispositions. This is how some lawyers make a lot of money. They make out wills, and sometimes they just leave things to the lawyers, as strange as that may seem. But a lot of times the lawyers will hide assets, things like a painting or whatever, and then they will just buy the painting before the estate sale. They'll just buy it from the estate, at its lower price, and so they make a lot of money. This is kind of a rip-off. I'm trying to tell you that some lawyers are unethical, and maybe I shouldn't say that. Clinicians may be called on to give an opinion about a deceased person's state of mind as it existed at a specific time before their death. And usually this has to do with when they made out their will, when they made some decision about money. Sometimes a clinician will be asked to do this. These evaluations are termed psychological autopsies because the person's already dead. And it's really difficult to say, well, you know, how lucid were you on July 15th, 6 months ago? How lucid were you? You can't do that because the person's dead, for one thing. And even if they were still alive, they wouldn't remember whether they were lucid or not 6 months ago or whatever. So this is, a lot of times they're asked to do these psychological autopsies to determine if they were actually lucid when they made out the will. This all has to do with bucks. This all has to do with money. It has to do with money. Most rely on information from two sources. They interview third parties who knew the decedent, and they look at prior records. So if there was no mental health evaluations that were being done at the time, they really don't have any mental health records. They may look at medical records to see if any interesting things happen. A lot of times older people will have TIAs. These are small strokes that affect a very tiny part of their brain. So sometimes they'll lose memory, sometimes they will change the way that they think. So that they can look at their medical records potentially, and they can determine if there is a possibility that there was some kind of a mental breakdown taking place. They can interview third parties. Now, if you remember, I told you that my brother brother's wife decided that my brother with PTSD was not lucid enough to be the executor of the will. And of course, we're talking to third parties. So if you're talking to sisters-in-law or you're talking to a brother-in-law, a lot of times you get one story that you don't get from another member of another individual. If you're talking to somebody in a select family, a lot of times families are in denial about how functional somebody is. I have a brother that came back from Vietnam, and he was a mess, just a mess. And he suffered from PTSD, but my parents wouldn't admit it. So he never went to treatment of any kind at all. He had anger issues from time to time. People were afraid of him. He worked for the state of Indiana. He was a surveyor for the state of Indiana. People were afraid of him. They thought he was going to go off on them, or he was going to bring a gun to work. I mean, for years, everybody's just scared to death of my brother. Anyway, so if you ask different people, they will have different opinions of somebody's lucidity. As far as I'm concerned, I thought my brother was okay. I did think he had PTSD. He did some really strange things. He had some anger issues. One time when I was home, these kids were driving down in front of our house. They were driving down the road in front of our house, and they stopped and they got out of the car and they dumped all their aluminum cans in the ditch. And of course, it upset my brother. So he went over, and there were 4 of them, and they were, well, we're not very big people, but there were 4 of them. And so I went with my brother. He had an axe in his hand, and and these were just teenagers, punks. And he told them, "You better pick up all those cans, or you're not going anywhere." That's what he told them. And of course, they started swearing at him, and that didn't help at all. Not at all. And so I came running over. And of course, they thought that I was backing him up, but what I was really doing was trying to keep him from chopping their car up with his axe. So 2 of them were yelling at my brother and swearing at my brother, and the other 2 were picking up the cans and throwing them back in the back seat. And so finally they said, "Oh, if we ever see you again, we're going to kick your ass," that kind of stuff. And my brother said, "Come on. Go ahead."
With an axe in his hand, right?
And then they got in their car and drove away. Okay, but, so the question, I can't remember why I said this. Okay, I don't remember why I was telling, third parties. So I knew my brother was messed up. One of the things he did, he built rifle pits around our property, just in case. You never know. Just in case the Kong are around. Not a whole lot of Kong in Muncie, Indiana, but you never know. You never know when they're going to come around. He cut firing areas, so that he cleared out areas so that he had clear fields of fire.
We had too many helicopters at our house.
Well, if you had helicopters, that's one thing. He did
Yeah,
that.
but my husband was one of the more dramatic of the PTSD
Mhm.
groups. He was in Denver for quite a while, and he had been home alone for about a half a day that granddaughter and I went shopping. We came back home. He walked out the back door. He had a knife in each hand, and I brought the truck around like I always do to unload it from groceries and stuff and hay. And he started stabbing on my window.
He didn't recognize.
He did not recognize us. He thought we were the enemy. And my granddaughter went into the house because we didn't have a phone with us. And she grabbed his phone, but he was not aggressive to her, only toward the truck and the person inside of it, which was me.
That's interesting.
So some of it is really, really sad.
Yeah, well, that's the whole point. I mean, so if somebody looks at a situation, they see one thing, somebody else looks at the situation, they're in denial, they see something totally different. And of course, that's the problem with the psychological autopsies. How can you possibly get a real picture when you're dealing with a family that's in denial and you're dealing with other individuals that have always hated this select individual, and they see them totally different.
When you're living it, it's really difficult to deny it.
Well, my parents were living the same thing, and they were in denial.
Were they?
Yeah. Anyway, so the reliability of a psychological autopsy is relatively low because you can't get into the mind of a dead person, and you can't ask them questions. How has testimony about psychological autopsies fared in court? In cases involving workers' compensation claims and questions of whether insurance benefits should be paid, the courts have usually admitted psychological autopsy testimony. So as long as it's workers' compensation, we're not talking about big piles of money. We're just talking about workers' compensation. They will allow psychological autopsy testimony. In criminal cases or in cases involving the question of whether a person had the mental capacity to execute a will, the courts have been more reluctant to permit the testimony, and this is because of the amount of money that is being dealt with. The more money there is, the less likely that they are to accept a psychological autopsy. So now we're going to talk about child custody cases. Of course, my grandson is a child custody case, so this is very close to my experience, I guess. A number of years ago, they decided that what they needed to do was, when they looked at a custody case, they needed to look at the best interest of the child. Before, the child always went to the mother, or the child never went to the father, or it was always a cut and dry case. But then they realized, oh my goodness gracious, sometimes they're putting these kids in homes with mothers, and the mothers have lots of boyfriends, and the boyfriends are molesting the children. Maybe we need to look at these cases a little bit closer. So what they decided that they needed to do was they needed to view a case from the best interest of the child and not worry about mom or dad. Mom or dad are going to be okay, but what we need to do is make sure that the child is taken care of. Before, they weren't. The child really wasn't even a factor. They were just declaring the divorce, and they were giving the child to one person or another. Hey, Greg.
Yeah, hey, can I listen in?
Sure, come on in. So now we're talking about the child custody and parental fitness, evaluating families for the purpose of sit down, Greg.
Oh, I gotta go talk with our boss.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm just curious, that's all.
Okay.
I'm being nosy.
Good, well that's good, we like nosiness. Evaluating families for the purpose of recommending a custodial arrangement that is in the best interest of a child whose parents are divorcing or separating is a fast-growing area. Some states accept this, some states do not. The state of Florida does, and that's where my daughter had her custody case down in Florida. So it was really kind of an interesting situation. If you know anything about my family, we really don't have that much money, but her baby daddy, can I call him that? Because they were never married, so he's not her ex-husband. The sperm donor of my grandson comes from a wealthy family, comes from a relatively wealthy family. And because of that, they had a lot of money to throw at the custody case, as interesting as that may or may not be. So here we are, we're fighting a custody battle. All my daughter wanted to do was move to a state where it was a better place to raise a child, Iowa, which is one of the best states, the fourth state in the union according to everybody that evaluates this stuff. It's the fourth best place to raise a child in the United States. Florida is 37th. New Mexico is 50th. And Arizona is 49th. And there's a reason why you guys are in such bad shape. There's a reason why Florida is not a good place to raise children. Any place where you have a lot of snowbirds, individuals who live there but don't really pay a whole lot of taxes in the state, the education tends to be second rate. And that's the way it is in Florida. My son is teaching, it's his 5th year teaching. He makes in the $40,000 range. I have a niece who teaches in Chicago, and she makes over $100,000 a year. Yeah, okay, so the wages are really low. It's very expensive to live in Florida. Yet the teachers are only making, in the $40,000 to $50,000 range. It's not very much money at all. So it's a tough place to teach. You're not making very much money. So my daughter had taught there for 17 years and was making, top dollar, $46,000. She was making $46,000 a year. And so she was looking for a job where she could make more money. In Iowa, which is cheaper, it's cheaper to live in Iowa, she was making $66,000. So she wanted to move to Iowa. There's a shock for you. It's a better place to raise kids. The people are a little bit, anyway, they're younger because there are so many snowbirds. Anyway, so she wanted to move to Iowa. And so they took her to court. The baby daddy took her to court. The increase in these cases is attributable to 2 factors. One is that 50% of the marriages in the United States end in divorce. 50%! 1 out of every 2 marriages in the United States end in divorce. As of 2010, 34% of the households with children in the United States were single-parent families. And that's, of course, the way I raised my kids for 5 years all by myself. So, yes, that's my daughter has never been, well, she was married, but she didn't have the child at the time when she was married. And she was never married to the guy that she had the baby with. Anyway, so, and she's raising the kid all by herself, 34%. Actually, she's raising the child with my wife, who helps her whenever possible. Right now, she's trying to buy a new car because she has a Florida car, and she needs an Iowa car. Florida cars are 2-wheel drive. Usually, it's rear-wheel drive. They never get any ice or snow. They don't need to go anywhere. And of course, everything's paved in Florida. Almost the whole damn state is blacktop. So, you never go off-road. So you don't have to worry about mud. You don't have to worry about snow. You don't have to worry about ice. So what kind of cars do they sell down there? Well, they sell cars that why would anybody buy a 4-wheel drive car in Florida? That doesn't make any sense.
Because they're cute.
No, they look the same. The only difference is it
That's what my
has.
granddaughter says. It was cute, so I bought it.
She live in Florida?
No, she lives in Maryland,
Oh,
but she was from California, so what can I say?
yeah. Southern or northern?
Central, Santa Rosa.
Okay, so that they get some bad weather.
Yeah, I know. Only
And
right.
Maryland definitely gets bad weather. They get ice storms that are just god awful.
Yeah, she's been up there for 3 years now, and she's getting a little more acclimated,
That happens. Anyway, when we lived in DC, we used to get ice storms off the Chesapeake because the Chesapeake base right there, oh, it was bad. Preference for maternal custody diminished at the beginning of the 21st century. They realized, oh my God, these women are not all good mothers. Some of them are really bad mothers. Now many courts want to know about the parenting abilities of each parent before deciding custody. Are they going to take care of the child? Who's going to take care of the child if the mother has to work or the mother has to go someplace? Is there somebody to take care of the child? And they want to know what type of parents they are. Currently, the prevailing standard for custody decisions is the future best interest of the child. And of course, that's exactly what they were talking about when they went to court. When my daughter went to court with her significant other. Risk factors when a child is involved. The stress of the initial separation for the child is never pretty. It's always kind of painful. Diminished parenting, of course, because now we've only got one parent. That parent has to do stuff. They have to maintain the house, they have to clean the house, they have to cook. They are not always available to take care of the child, or to be with the child, or to give the child the attention that they need. So there is always diminished parenting. Before they were getting parenting from both a male and a female, if it was a male and female relationship. So they were always getting dual parentage. Sometimes, of course, some individuals don't pay attention to their kids. Sometimes neither parent pays attention to their kids. So diminished parenting is very real. A lot of times in wealthy families, they have to hire people to take care of the kids because mom and dad have so much else to do. Dad's always at work, or mom's always at work, and the other person is always doing something else. Loss of significant relationships, including extended family, for example, grandparents and friends. Of course, this was one of the factors that they looked at when they were bringing, when my daughter tried to bring my grandson up to Iowa. They were looking at extended family. The interesting thing about his family is they're wealthy, and wealthy people don't always pay attention to things like kids. You know, kids aren't important, so they hire nannies and whatnot. They hire people to pay attention to their children, as weird as that is. But he had to leave two sets of grandparents. Yeah, because the mom and dad had been divorced and they had been remarried, and they were remarried. So he had to leave two sets of grandparents for one set of grandparents in Iowa. Multiple moves, including changing schools and loss of friends. We were lucky. He moved when he was 4 years old. He was going to start kindergarten the next year. So he really didn't have to change schools because he was in preschool before. But he's a very affable little guy, and he makes friends wherever he goes. He just loves everybody, which gets him in trouble sometimes because he likes to hug people. He's a hugger. So sometimes they have to make him stop hugging people. He likes to put his arm around people, you know.
Be glad he's not a girl.
And they're not, and of course now they don't let them touch each other. Yeah, when they're playing for recess. Either parent becoming involved with a new partner, and of course this is always a problem. Does the new partner like kids? Do they want kids? The child, suddenly they're getting less attention from their parent because the parent's paying more attention to the boyfriend or girlfriend, whichever the case may be. And of course that parent or that new boyfriend or whatever, or girlfriend may have different ideas. I know it's odd to think of me having girlfriends, but I was a single parent for 5 years, but from time to time I would find somebody who was willing to put up with me, and I rejected some of them because they had different parenting styles than I did. And so, I was looking for somebody that treated their kids like I did. I mean, one of the reasons that me and my first wife broke up is because she wanted to just wail the tar out of the kids whenever they were bad. That's strict discipline, that's what she was after. And I told her, no, you don't have to do that. Just talk to them. They're smart, they can figure it out. They won't do it again if you talk to them. And to this day, my kids hate it when I talk to them because they think they've done something wrong. And of course, instead of hitting them and spending 3 seconds smacking them, I spend an hour sitting there talking to them and telling them why it was wrong to do what they did.
But the lecture is more painful, trust me.
Which was torture. They considered it torture, and they still do. So they do not like to talk to me. I haven't talked to my son in about 3 months because, we'd always get on the phone and he asks for advice, and then I give it to him, and then he gets mad because I gave him advice. I don't understand. People are so weird.
You have to do it gently, Dad.
It's
With a smack or two here and there.
It's sad that I don't have a gentle bone in my body. The Uniform Marriage Divorce Act said courts should consider the following. First of all, the wishes of the child, of course, at 4 years old. They did not take that into account. The wishes of the child's parents, of course, my daughter wanted to leave Florida, and the baby daddy wanted them to stay in Florida. The relationships between the child and the parents, siblings, and significant others. We interact with the child, and this became a huge factor because he claimed that his family paid a lot of attention to my grandson, which they actually didn't. They didn't interact with him hardly at all. The child's adjustment at home, school, and in the community, and of course this was a big factor. This was not much of a factor because, of course, he was just 4 years old, so there wasn't a whole lot of this taking place. The physical and mental health of the parties involved, and of course that was part of the problem. And I think I have to stop right now. Yeah, let's go ahead and stop right here. Anyway, so we'll talk about this more, and I'll tell you the whole sordid story of my